Question number 3, Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement, quote, well, if we were selling Housing New Zealand, the corporation, or 25% or 49%, yes, that would be an asset sale?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
Why does he think selling Housing New Zealand, a bureaucracy, would be an asset sale, but selling up to 22,000 of its houses worth around $5 billion would not be an asset sale?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, firstly the member's making it up. I've never said that we're going to sell that many houses. I'm simply making the point that if Housing New Zealand sells some homes, as they did under the previous Labor government, about 1,000 of them, then I don't class that to be an asset sale.
Well, supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette.
Well, in light of that answer, will there be more houses built or bought by the government to replace the number of state houses sold under the Great State House sell-off?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
What I can guarantee is that there will be more people accommodated under income-related rents and therefore having accessibility to affordable homes. And in the end, that's the real point here, is that we want to see more New Zealanders getting access to that very low-cost level of housing, and it's much more sensible to ask community housing providers and others to do that with access to income-related rents than simply for Housing New Zealand to buy them.
Well, supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Well, in light of that answer...
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Does he stand by his statement that the fastest way of moving people out of poverty is to deliver more income-related rents? If so, how is he going to get the houses to apply those subsidies without simply subsidising private landlords?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, well, firstly, the only people who can get income-related rents are community housing providers or Housing New Zealand. So the Labor Party knows so little about, fundamentally so little about rents, it can't even work out what a capital gains tax is going to do, and therefore it can't even work out who gets an income-related rent.
Oh, yeah. Would it be nice if the Prime Minister answered the question?
Supplementary question. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What discussions have taken place with social housing providers in light of Monte Cecilia Housing Trust, an important provider, saying yesterday the government seems to be able to make announcements one day and then, quote, well, tell us we're not really done the details the next day. Isn't it what you'd call a shambles for them?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can't tell you exactly what discussions have been held because I'm not responsible for that. But there are a wide range of community housing providers, and I think there's about 30 in total. Actually, my understanding is that there have been 32. Thank you. My understanding is that there's been wide-ranging discussions. But what is clear is the government's intent in this area has been foreshadowed for quite some time, and what we are endeavouring to do is to make sure that the social housing sector in New Zealand grows. Well, the worst ramble of the year is from the 4 wannabe leaders who can't even turn up to Parliament.
Order.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
Well, does he agree with the Auckland Community Housing Network that, quote, selling houses at a time of shortage makes no sense unless the funds from the sale are invested back so there is a net increase in new social and affordable housing? If not, why won't he commit to this?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, certainly if one was just solely selling a Housing New Zealand house and there was no other replacement in the form of a community housing provider or somebody else that could provide a house, of course that would make no sense because the amount of houses available to low-income people would be by definition reducing, and the government's whole plan here is to increase it. But Mr Speaker, just before the members opposite, well, Sue Moroney should just be quiet for a second and listen to this important point. If members opposite want to get all excited about selling things, then maybe the member should remember that she was part of a government that sold Southern Hydro That's right, Phil. For $1.6 billion, there was 16% of the assets of Meridian.
Order. The answers now move well past the question that was asked.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
When the Prime Minister said a moment ago that their policy was very clear, why did he not make it clear during the election campaign that they intended to sell? No, Prime Minister said yesterday he couldn't make it clear because no one wanted to talk about housing. So why didn't he tell the public that he intended to sell a significant chunk of state houses, some of them to property speculators?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, a few things. Firstly, as I pointed out yesterday, the Labor Party was fixated with talking about everything other than policy, and we know where that took them. Secondly, interestingly enough, this is a story from the 26th of February 2014, and it's titled, "English Talks Up Big State Housing Reform." That was, by the way, quite a few months before the election, Mr Speaker. And thirdly, I've had a flick through the Labor Party election manifesto, and I never saw any part of their manifesto talking about selling 16% of the assets of Meridian in the form of Southern Hydro.
I thank the Prime Minister, but that's not his responsibility.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
Is the Prime Minister saying that in the numerous public meetings he held, in the Four Leaders debate, the whistle-stop tours and the hundreds of ops for selfies, he never had even a nanosecond to tell those he met that he intended to flog off billions of dollars of state houses because he thought the Labor Party was busy talking about something else?
Order. Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
The point I was making was, A, it was in our policy, B, the Finance Minister had given a speech at the start of the year on it, C, Mr Speaker, my main point was that the Leader of the Opposition didn't want to talk about it, and neither did anyone else. They wanted to talk about every other little trumped-up scandal, but they didn't want to talk about policy, and that's why, by the way, they polled the worst result in living history of the Labor Party for 92 years. So if you want to go and have a rerun of the election campaign and talk about policy, you might do better, but oops, you don't have a leader to do that.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Point of order.
Order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order.
I seek leave.
I haven't called the member yet.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I seek leave.
Point of order, Honourable Annette King.
I seek leave to table the 2002 election result where the National Party got 20.9%.
I've heard enough and there's no need to do it.
Question.
Order.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Kevin Haig. Order.
Does the Prime Minister guarantee that all proceeds from the sale of state houses will be used for social housing purposes?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no decisions have been made yet on what the proceeds will go to, but what I can guarantee the member is that as a result of this policy, more poor and vulnerable New Zealanders will have an affordable roof over their head. And I would have thought if the member wanted to stop playing politics and start caring about the poor people, he'd come over and support the national government.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Kevin Haig.
Well, if it's not resolved what the proceeds will be used for, what else might they be used for besides social housing purposes?
Right, Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
As I said, that decision hasn't been made. In the fullness of time, it will. And we'll be happy to stand on the policy and the record of this government. But what I do know is that as a result of this policy, more New Zealand families, more vulnerable families will have an affordable roof over their head. I define that as success.
Question number 4, Paul Foster-Bell.